more practical stuff. So as was advertised, I'm going to talk about two cases, and actually I'm just going to introduce those cases in a bit of an overview, because to be very honest, both of those are still ongoing. One is from public sector, the other one is a bank, because obviously what else could I tell you than financial sector, loving it so much. The point of the talk is more of what we have learned from working with such large and diverse institutions, how we figured a new, well, maybe it's not exactly completely new, maybe there is something similar somewhere else, and I would be actually very happy to hear from you guys if you're using anything similar that we have developed. The main takeaway I'm hoping is this one new approach to working with personas based on those two case studies. But before we dive in, just a quick walkthrough of how does a typical service design project start. Probably because of my academic background, I'm really into research. So our team is very diverse, and we have great team members who are working on actual delivery of the products or some e-solutions. But for me, this greatest part of service design projects is not so much the solutions, but it's actually finding the problems, and for that the whole in-depth research that we conduct. In a standard project, we actually start off with talking to our customers, meeting the organization that we're supposed to deliver value for, and we try to get all the stakeholders in the room, which is usually a quite interesting exercise, because for some reason, and I'm talking about large institutions, right? So banks are typically very big, public sector as well. Quite big institutions with many departments. It's very interesting that very often that before we invite them into our workshops, they have not worked together so much, or they have often not even met. That we have to start with this in the same company. We would have to start with an introduction round where people would explain who are they and what they do, not just to us, but also to their colleagues. So this is the first step. We get to know the organization. We try to understand who wants what, who protects which goals, and then where do they all want to get with the projects and leaders in the end. We also take a really deep dive into existing services of the company. I know that there are many service designers who prefer to design from scratch, and not even looking into what already exists, because it's one view that it sort of limits your imagination if you kind of play around the same pool that has existed before. However, there's very often, again, when you're working with established organizations, there's always something that is good and that customers love and that works. And then we try to navigate through existing solutions, try to understand which ones are great and worth saving, and which ones are we maybe should be nominated to be let go, so to say. After that, together with so we still have not seen the customers, right? So this is the very kick off of the project. We talk to the clients, and we try to understand who do they see as personas. So we'll let them imagine people or the customers for a second, and it actually gives you a very clear understanding if they know their customer, if they have used some customer feedback systems, or have they talked to customers before or not. It gives you a very clear picture of how imaginary are customers for them in real life. In this part, we also usually invite them to describe the extreme customers, so who are for them extremely good or extremely bad ones. And this is actually very helpful because using the method that I'm going to explain to you a bit later, these extremes are really, really valuable. After we have mapped the personas, we actually try to find the real people and compare the reality to, let's say, the imaginary world of the company. So we conduct a huge chunk of interviews, and we actually try to stick to in-depth interviews. Again, this is something that probably comes from my academic background, but for some reason, I mean, I know that there are a lot of people who will not agree with me on this. I do not believe in surveys. I do not support any quick, short interviews because, well, there's an approach when you would go to talk to people for just a few minutes to get maybe some essential feedback. But to me, it sounds more like verbal questionnaire that maybe is not written. But my strong belief that if you want to find out something new, and if you would like to get some authentic insight to the customers, it's better just to have 3 or 4 interviews. It's far more valuable than to send out the hundreds of questionnaires, because you are actually going to learn more. And depending on the scope of the project, we do from 15 up to 50 interviews. It depends heavily on what kind of service we are talking about, but that usually, in that range, you usually get quite a heavy amount of insights. And after that, we actually dive into journeys to figure out the whole flow of service usage, to find how does the customer perceive the complexity. So what you can actually see here on the picture is it's an actual customer journey of making a payment in internet bank. So this the whole wall is something that the bank was like, yeah, customer logs in and makes the payment. There's 2 steps. And this is what it actually turned out to be, so based on the interviews. So we actually go very deeply into journeys, which I'm sure pretty much every other service designer does. And based on that, we conclude what is actually our task, because at this point, it's typically pretty clear that whatever customer was approaching us with, whatever was the initial problem, that it's completely something different. And whatever solution they had in mind at first, it might not fix anything in the end. There's one more step that is proven to be essential, that we decided that we need to do in every project, regardless if we were asked to do that or it's on top, let's say on the house. This is the summary of research. And if the customer has asked us just to do the research part, this is the thing that we hand over. If this is the project where we also are hired to develop the solution, this mid-step in the form of this report is also very necessary for a very simple reason, because usually by this point, the project has gone on for 3-4 months, and the management starts asking questions. So this is usually typically the point when when the board goes like, okay, so you have been working for such a long time, when do we see the results? And I actually believe that these physical reports, and make no mistake, we actually print them out and hand them over in a folder, because in this way it seems more real to them. This actually concludes that there is a huge amount of data, of information, of research that has been done. And actually, very often management actually decides to spread these reports across the whole organization, even to the counterparts that are maybe not connected in any way to the initial project, because everybody finds value in those. And in one of the projects that I'm going to talk about today. We actually, after spreading the reports and after sharing the reports with the client, we noticed that even the people who are not connected to the service design project in any way, they have never participated in a workshop, they have never seen us before, but they're actually using the names of the personas just because they have somehow seen the reports across the company, and it sort of stuck, and it started living its own life. So I actually very strongly encourage everyone to do this kind of reporting and not just leave it on the post-its or on canvases, but actually give it some physical shape. So this is how the project generally goes. And in two of, yeah, you're waving at me, so I'm guessing there's a question.
Yes, just a small one from my side. You said a couple of minutes before that you start by asking your customer about their clients, how they see them, and you said that you can easily see whether they understand their customer. Can you give an example? How would you understand that they understand their customers or not?
Well, first of all, how confused they are. If they actually start describing a real person in the workshop and the information just starts appearing on the canvas, or they end up being confused and start imagining. So that's already, or they point or give an example of some case that has recently happened, and maybe somebody talked with an actual customer some time ago. And that actually gives you, it's just human reaction. It's very easy to see whether they start describing something that is real or they start imagining something that they just exists in their head.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right. I realize I'm talking pretty fast, so just jump in at any moment if there's something. So the two cases. Let's start with the banking one. So a few words about Coop Bank. It's actually a very new bank in a way that it has existed before, but it has been acquired. It has gone through rebranding. There is some existing customer base from the previous bank, but all in all, on the market, it's perceived as a pretty new player. So it's a bit different. Why it was so exciting to work with it is because it's a bit different from the classical universal bank we have here on the market. So for those of you who don't know, the typical bank in Estonia, it's a Swedish large bank that has a branch here. It's a Swedish brand, and obviously sort of all these solutions, all these services have a quite heavy Swedish influence. And those very few players who are local on the market, they usually are very strong in their communication, saying that they're locals, and Coop Bank is one of them, really highlighting their local origin. What else makes them unique is that because, as probably in many of your countries as well, Coop is actually a retail store network. So also in Estonia, they're sort of sister companies. And due to this connection to store network, they actually provide their banking services such as cash out, cash in, through the stores. So they don't need essentially to have so many branches because you can do some of the minor operations through stores. And why it's so important, or why it has created such a big difference for them on the market, is because all these big Swedish scary banks are closing down the branches in the rural areas. So they're keeping their banking branches mostly in the bigger cities or in sort of bigger centers, and they're distancing themselves from rural areas, providing just the digital services there, or at best maybe ATMs. So here the communication and the whole the whole image of the bank is being very close in small places, very kind of close to rural areas and distant areas in Estonia. And they actually came to us saying that they would like to improve their digital services, and they would like to do a bit of research of how the best possible mobile app for banking would look like. So it's an honest attempt to design from scratch, because typically, again, if you would look at, I think if you would look at the banking digital solutions worldwide, they're quite copy-paste, right? So there's not much uniqueness in this market. So there's a certain inertia, a certain, like, if everybody has, we also need to have it. And here we have a client approaching saying, okay, let's look at this from the clean slate, and let's really see what kind of findings from the research we could find, what kind of preferences, unmet needs from the clients we could discover. And we actually did a very extensive research. Maybe for some of you, 5 locations for customer interviews does not seem like much, but I remind you, we're a super tiny country. It's like 200 kilometers to one side and then 200 kilometers to the other. And then you have either sea or Russia or pretty much nothing else. Okay, Latvia as well, but so picking 5 locations is already for such a tiny territory, it's quite a lot. So we really went out there. We picked out 36 people, and we really did very random sampling. So we had people from Coop Bank, so the existing clients. We had people who have pretty much never heard of this bank. So we had very diverse, and very also in the ages, you can see that there is pretty big difference. And this was actually also a request from the client. They said that yes, our current customer base is older, so it's when they describe their kind of average customer, they maybe were thinking more about this kind of from middle age to senior, but they were also especially interested in the youth. And we took some really, let's say, extremely young examples from 11 years old. And based on that, we have actually wireframed a pretty extensive amount of different screens for mobile app solutions that is yet to be tested. But as I said, this project is still ongoing. But the problem that we actually faced after those 36 interviews in all across the country was that we had so many learnings that when I tried to put together this next few slides for this presentation, I was actually confused. Okay, if I start presenting you all the learnings that we had from this, we will never finish. So I just concluded 3, but there were also quite surprising. And again, I remind you, I have been working in finance sector for a long time, and very often you sort of, as a service designer that has serviced near to 10 banks, you would be thinking, okay, there's nothing you can surprise me with anymore. But even for us, it was still something new. Well, first of all, awareness of the whole e-banking features and IT security that comes along with it was very different from what was expected. Again, we also, just as you, we also like to think that we're a very digitally developed country. So we also would like to have this kind of belief in ourselves. And that involves people being aware how to use the services. However, it turned out that very often the whole patterns and understanding of what is secure, what is not, is completely vice versa from how it actually is. I'm going to give you an example, which, okay, it's not exactly e-banking or digital banking, but it's how people perceive payment with a card or with a mobile device. So everyone pretty much without any exceptions, was saying that they feel that paying with their watch or with their mobile phone with the NFC payment feels very insecure. So more or less everybody has heard some scary stories about how people run around with POS devices, rubbing them against your back pockets and, you know, stealing money from you. And nobody would ever actually think about that. Typically, your phone is actually protected with biometrics. So unless you actually are touching or looking at your phone, that it's actually protected. So this felt very unsafe for them. However, when we asked them about contactless payments with the credit cards, that felt perfectly safe. No idea why. And actually it's vice versa again, because your card doesn't have any biometrics protection or anything. So in reality, it's not like that, but the whole prejudice and the whole sort of perception of how people perceive security was completely mind-blowing. A second discovery, which was also sort of shocking, is that people would really love to automate all of their payments, but it's not the people that we thought would like to do so. So in our heads, when the assumption was that it's the younger generation that would like to do so, or let's say more, well, maybe middle-aged people. But what we discovered is actually seniors who would like for everything to happen automatically and to actually use all these e-invoices that we have in this country, or automatic payments of the invoices, that your utility bills or your phone bills, they just leave your account without you doing any extra confirmation. And the younger ones, very often, they wanted the control and the overview, and they wanted to confirm it separately. So that was also very interesting discovery in behavior that, yes, people love these features, but not the people you would expect. The third one is actually, nevertheless, this is just 200-kilometer difference. Geography really matters. So I remember actually coming back from one of the last interview rounds we had in northeast of the country, I'm sorry. And I remember coming back to the office and going, oh my goodness, this basically, this completely opposite from what we've heard anywhere else. So the behaviors of people living in the cities or living in more remote locations, people living in purely Estonian-speaking territory, or is in this Northeast, which is more in Russian-speaking informational influence. The preferences, the behaviors, the patterns of how they use digital solutions, they're completely different. So what we had in the end was, well, of course, also besides those three, there's about like 7 more, this kind of huge conclusions. But what we had in the end is we had a huge amount of data from the interviews, and a lot of behavior patterns, a lot of journeys. And we had this question that this is all great, but which one, or which persona, which journey do we actually start designing for? Because there's just so much, they're also different, and they all fit into the scope of essential targets group of the bank. So before I give you the answer what we did next, I'm going to quickly walk you through the next case, which is a really different when you think of who is the client and what the research was about, but that led us pretty much to the same point. So it's actually, I just now thought of this, both of those projects, they started at the exact same week. So we started both of those in the first week of January 2020. So maybe that's the composition, why they ended up in this presentation together, but yeah, it's a fun fact. So Enterprise Estonia is a governmental institution that basically aims to develop Estonian businesses and give them boost, not just locally, but also bring them to the world. So all those big success cases that you might have heard is usually somehow backed by Enterprise Estonia. By sometimes monetary grants, sometimes it's something related to educational learning, sometimes it's just contact making or some other kind of support, but they basically try to provide really different services for businesses and growing companies that would like to grow very ambitiously. So their specialty is that they work B2B. So not a single private person is their target audience. So everything they do is for business organizations. And these business organizations are quite different, but in the beginning of the project, we agreed that we work in the framework of this project to make it a bit easier. We thought it would make it easier. We would be targeting only Estonian companies. So no foreign companies are in scope. And the ambition was actually to simplify the offering, simplify the customer journey. So when a company decides that I would like to start exporting my goods, for example, to United States of America, they turn to Enterprise Estonia for advice or help or some funding. And this journey is usually very, very complex, quite long as well. So it's not a short-term project or service. And the scope of different value propositions that they provide is simply huge. So if you would currently go to their websites, I think it's like selection of 85 different services that they have listed. And if you're a client that comes to get an overview, you simply drown in this 85 services. You just gone. And if you don't have any contact, connection, or recommendation, you just most probably you just close this page and you never interact with it again. So our task was actually to simplify it, and one of the aims is to design a web page that would create this clarity and understanding in the eyes of the client. And once again, we followed our process, the same one that I walked you through in the very beginning. We started with going through various customers, interviewing them and talking through the journeys, trying to understand how they interacted with Enterprise Estonia so far. We also found a few clients who gave up in the process. So they sort of had the idea of getting some support or had the idea of becoming a customer of Enterprise Estonia, but then gave up for some reason. So we also tried to look into those cases. And also very quickly we realized that besides interviews, in this particular case, we would also need to do the content analysis of existing materials and service regulations, because it's public sector, so it's all the services are very heavily regulated. There's guidelines, there's really a lot of materials. So this content analysis took also quite significant amount of work. And we also had quite several workshops with the stakeholders, trying to get them in sync as well, because also the interesting dimension of this particular organization is that it has well, let's call these four different departments working with 4 different topics. And they don't really interact with each other or overlap with each other too much. So they're quite isolated, and so they work quite efficiently like this. But from the user's perspective, from customers' perspective, it's quite common for the company to be in touch in parallel with a few different specialists in different departments, and then he gets the feeling that he's just talking to 3 different organizations because they're not also aware of the information exchange, or he needs to deliver information from one counterparty to the other. So it's really like, if there is one word to to describe it, it's complexity. But what was a big win is because of the fact that we managed to get in these workshops, we actually managed to get really high level management. So we had 3 out of 3 board members present in most of the workshops, actually discussing the topics and working on the services. It was amazing to see that after 3 or 4 months of this kind of very persistent discussions and very persistent coming back with the research results, even some people who were in the beginning questioning the whole value of design approach or service design, or asking users for the feedback, those people actually came back to us a few weeks ago saying, you know, it seems like this is something that everybody needs to get trained on, that it's something that, you know, the whole organization should start doing, not just us here in this project, but it seems really valuable and really kind of mind-blowing results are coming out of it. Maybe we should try it everywhere. So in kind of this process of structuring the whole thing, because we have been really heavily pinging everybody in the organization, they actually started seeing value and considering maybe they should start doing it on a broader scale as well. But coming back to our project, so we have still a web page to design. We have talked to 26 different customers, and we're still very kind of still structuring data. What we have concluded, however, is that, well, point 1, there's far more complexity than anybody has dared to imagine. Also, if some of you have come across the European Union regulations, what comes along with that, all the legislation. So even if you're trying to simplify description or the introduction of a service, you simply not allowed to do that, or heavily limited at least, because there's some sort of law that says that you have to do it in a very complex kind of way. So there's far more complexity of dependencies as well in the organization that we could ever imagine. The second conclusion was actually very interesting, because maybe if you read the media, then the only thing that you would hear over the last few years about Enterprise Estonia have been, well, not so positive news. But when we talked to the customers, they were absolutely happy with all the services that they have received. Yes, it has been complex, and actually I'm a bit suspecting that it is in some sort of correlation. You know, you appreciate stuff that you work hard for. So one of those effects, because it is so complex and you have to actually educate yourself, and you have to try hard to get these services. But when you do, they're really great, and they're really helpful, and they really help your business in the end. So all the customers that have made it to the end of journey were extremely positive. What we also concluded after talking to customers is that this is all great, but in about half of customer journeys, there was never even mention of a web page. So we are kind of trying to bring together the information that would simplify the life of the user, and then kind of shorten this informational ping pong that is happening in emails very often. But about 50% of customers actually never end up there, and they are pretty certain that there is actually no reason even for them to go there, because either their contact person in the organization actually explains everything to them, or sends them the information, or they show up in person, and that solves a lot. So they actually avoid this web space quite heavily. But then again, it's a bit, there's always this kind of moment of caution when there's a claim from the customer and saying that, yeah, no, I would never use that, because he only has this answer based on the current solution, right? So it's no point in asking, would you ever use if there would be something else? So this is still kind of based on whatever has existed so far. Maybe in the future it would change a bit. But again, 50% of customers never have even seen the web. So once again, the same question as with the bank. We have a huge amount of data. We have analyzed a whole bunch of interviews, and they're all different, like really different. So one user journey is very complex, very long, very confusing, with a lot of going back and forth. And one is very clear and simple, and there is no understanding of why it is so, and based on what do these distinguishes happen. So actually, we ended up in one of workshops in pretty heated discussion. We had the personas on the walls, and we're sort of trying to figure out together with clients, who would you like to design for it? So whose life are we actually trying to fix? And there is a huge discussion in the room. Nobody agrees with anyone. If you have had one of those, it's after a while it becomes very hopeless for the facilitator, because there's like no unanimous opinion or no hope for it to actually happen from somewhere. So at some point, in this heated discussion, we stumbled upon a tool that it just happened, and then we looked at it afterwards, and it made a lot of sense, and we started using it in other projects as well. And it's actually has been super helpful in these cases where you have huge organizations with a lot of stakeholders, with a lot of different services, and as a consequence, a lot of different personas. As I mentioned, we always asked our customers first to define the very extreme personas. And after you have a couple of those, it's very easy to distinguish why are they extreme? So why is this particular persona such an extreme case, and what would be the opposite of this? So when we were talking to this Enterprise Estonia, so this is a persona map or persona matrix for Enterprise Estonia in front of you. Don't tell anybody I showed it. So this is actually the tool that we sketched up on the boards as a next prompt. What we asked was, please identify the extreme persona. And they actually named one of the companies in Estonia, which is one of the largest companies. And immediately when they described this very specific actually existing persona, the second question is, what is the opposite of that? So what if this is an extreme, what would be the on the other side of the scale? And for them, they defined that if this one is the largest and sort of has a lot of capital, a lot of people, a lot of ambition, then on the other side probably would be some, one man's company, or man and the dog, as we call them, who is just working for himself. And here you, at this moment, you actually realize that the criteria that defines the extreme is the size of the company, quite plain and simple. So one of the axes you would actually have is the size. The other one, they, again, based on the same example of describing an extreme, one of the startup unicorns in Estonia. Well, we don't have too many of those, but so 1 out of 3. The criteria here was the business ambition. So sort of technological development and technological ambition. And then on one side of the scale, you would have this big technological unicorn startup. And on the other side is some, I don't know, local brewery that is using centuries old technology and is not really having any ambition to go very high tech. So they're manual labor, old technology. And in between, you would have many different companies who fits in all these other areas. The pink dots are actually the personas that we have interviewed. So we placed every single person that we have talked to on the scale to see who is fitting where from this company's perspective, from client's perspective. And immediately you actually see 4 categories of clients that have very distinguished differences in needs. They also have, if you look in this one category, then usually the customer journeys become automatically quite similar. You can see how they all follow a very typical path to the service. So you sort of get 4 personas instead of indefinite amount of numbers, and then it becomes super clear and super easy to operate with them. So in the end, we actually had quite strange, probably, names. If you look at those from this kind of different perspective, a bit strange names for personas, but they actually have a logic. So the ones on the top are the bigger companies with a bigger ambitions, the ones that are already flying, and one is obviously flying sort of not so high but already off the ground, and the other one is into space. So these are these high-tech super duper startups with a lot of capital. And in the bottom, you would have the guys that have their feet on the ground, so smaller companies. One is basically just moving in a very slow pace, and he's quite happy probably with what he's doing. He has pretty small added value, economically speaking, and also not so much of economic or technology ambition. And the other one is sort of climbing higher, but he's still, not flying too high, but has the ambition at least. The other matrix is quite similar to that one, and this is obviously for the second example that I told you about for the bank. They also happen sort of in parallel. So once having, so to say, invented this approach in one of the workshops, the next week we tried it on the banking example. And this is how we also structured the private persons for the client as well, having all these different personas and the stories of the personas. We managed to define 2 main criteria for what makes the difference. Criteria number 1, when you're creating a mobile app, it's obviously technological awareness. How much would the person want to do in digital form? The other one is for the bank, also might be quite obvious, how financially educated is the person. So how aware is the person of different financial issues? Is he or she doing well with investing, or is he or she basically living from one salary to the other without having any savings or using any complex financial products? And here, once again, we started placing all the existing interviews. So the pink dots here, actually, that's also something to note. The pink ones are the imaginary personas that the bankers drafted in the very first workshop we had with them. So when we asked, please describe what kind of people you see as your main customers, they mapped out these few personas. So actually there is, how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. And later on, the blue dots are the people that we actually interviewed, and we placed them on the scale. and actually forming, as you can see, one other persona that was not seen or not defined by the client in the first place. And also you can see here the grayscale-ish clouds of personas, which was quite common in the interview. So there was quite many people that represented a rather technologically aware type of a person, and who was also quite good with the finances. But here again, the client, the bank, said that it's okay, these are sort of too extreme for us. Let's focus maybe in the first wave on all these other ones, and these are not the primary audience to design for from the very beginning. So this again helped us structure quite a lot all the different people or types of people, and really go from this ambiguous storytelling and descriptive personas that maybe have a lot of value in the beginning of the project, but sort of start to lose value on the go when you go into solutions. And also when you go into testings, because now using this kind of charts or the matrix, it's actually becoming very clear for us whom we should test with the solutions once they start to get some sort of actual form. So I have been talking for quite some time.
We have a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Have you finished?
Well, I've actually like 3 more slides to go, but I think you can go ahead and ask.
Okay, so just in the order they come in. I start with mine because I'm a moderator. Sorry, you mentioned that you interviewed B2B customers for the enterprise of Estonia, but there is no B2B customer. It's a bunch of people within the organization. Whom did you interview?
That's actually a good question. I forgot to talk about it, but it's also based on the personas. It was it turned out to be a very different person in the company. So obviously, when you would have this man and the dog type of company, then there's the man, there is the owner of the company that would work with interact with the service. In the case of larger organizations, so to say, this pilot and the astronauts personas, there you would actually have a dedicated specialist that would be working with these services. So it's typically either head of export or head of marketing or some sort of not exactly management level person, but somebody more of a specialist type who is working with Enterprise Estonia on some very specific services. So we were looking for the person who actually has interacted with the services themselves.
Super. The technical question, how many designers would usually work for the project of the scale of Enterprise Estonia or the Coop Bank from your side?
Well, we currently have with Enterprise Estonia, we have, I would say, 4 people working on the project, rather pretty full time. So it's service designers, analysts, and graphic designers. So it's a pretty extensive team. With the bank, it's roughly the same. Yeah. So it's 3, 4, 5 people depending on the project and the phase of the project. So we also have this a bit of division. So let's say my part is generally in the phase of research, and then when it transitions into the delivery part, then maybe I step out from such an active contribution.
Okay, super. Then, does it happen that the client, again, of this size would not want to use your services? So, is there a chance that you convince them later to basically work with you?
What is the question? That they don't want to use it and
let me read it. Once the client have decided not to use services, did you use certain ways to try to bring them back?
Well, Not really. Well, the thing is that we actually managed somehow to, I guess, be very convincing is one thing.
Okay, so you never lost a client.
Well, we have lost a client, but I have to say, maybe it's the newcomers thing. I have to be very honest with you. It's not many. So the statistics is so good that it's actually scary. So for some reason, the clients actually believe that we can bring value quite a lot. And again, we're quite a small company, so we haven't had the necessity to chase anybody quite so much yet, at least, I guess. But once I can say that what happened in the company is that we worked with them for more than half a year, and they eventually became mature enough to actually manage on their own, and we helped them build up the service design team in-house. And I think that's the problem with our profession, right? That you actually eventually give them capabilities to do the thing on their own.
Yeah, this is a nice problem to have. How did you name the personas? Because you give a quite distinct names. How does it work?
Well, it's quite creative task. So this is literally, I can remember there has been a meeting dedicated to naming personas. So it's usually quite creative and quite descriptive names, especially in this banking side. So these are translations. Originally, there were in Estonian, and they sound a bit better in Estonian. But we usually try to make them descriptive in a way that the name that you hear of that actually gives you an impression what kind of a type we're talking about. So if any of you have a child or a small relative around 11 and 12 years old, then this Vance boy thing, it's a word. Grown-ups don't get it, but it's a word.
There is another question. I'm not sure I understand it, but maybe you understand it better. What if we have not two huge groups, but 3 or 4? What kind of matrix should it be in this case? If I believe that if you have more than 2 dimensions.
Well, actually, I have been challenging quite a few clients to give me more dimensions, and in practice, it has never happened so far. I'm actually looking forward for this moment when it happens, and how we will then give it 3D dimensions, maybe, not sure. But what is interesting is usually when you have this discussion and when you ask them for the extremes, they actually literally they run out of the examples, or they run out of these criteria after they have given you 2. So that has happened quite some times already with me, because we have been for this half a year we have been using this tool in very different settings, and also I have been testing it out at university with projects we have there with the students. It's always 2.
It's very consultish way, but my experience is the same.
Well, it's always 2. I don't know. Maybe it's some sort of mental block with that. When you have drawn the 2, then it just stops everybody from being creative. I don't know, but it's usually goes like this. Yeah.
And there is a question: how much time did it take to come to the solution? I believe how much time it took to actually create the map.
To create the map. Well, I think it happened in a way that in a one workshop, so you would have a draft very like this. It just happened, and then it's a living organism, because as an example of both of those projects, the interviews have been ongoing. So we have been adding the information to the map and to the materials that come with it. So there is more to it actually. They have been building up over a period of 3-4 months. So first you have just few dots, and then you realize that, okay, we have this separate persona coming up, but we don't have enough data, so we should look specifically for those people. Let's try to find those. And then you actually go and look out. So obviously we were never looking for a flower child, right? So it just happened. So we just found in some of the interviews, we found the people that matched this profile and formed a separate group.
Super, thank you. Well, I don't see more questions. If I overlooked some of them, just please copy it once again to the chat, and I think we can continue for the moment.
All right. So actually, the concluding slides is more or less the kind of tool guidelines, how to use it or what to do with it, if you would like to test it out. So first of all, first step is actually to do the usual personas drafting that you would do anyway with the client, and ask them very specifically for extremes, because, well, it's a really long known fact that designing for the extremes create the most value. After you have mapped out a couple of very extreme examples, then decide on what would be the axis. And it usually, once again, if you ask this question, what is the extreme and what is the opposite of this, the axis actually becomes very clear. So you sort of understand based on what do these guys opposite. Maybe it's the age, maybe it's I don't know, place of living, income, whatever. Can be very different things, but you immediately understand what it is. And so you can also identify the measurable criteria, because we use this 10 scale. So if you remember this Enterprise Estonia matrix, then it was in a way very strict, because you can actually know the size of the turnover of a company and to place them on this map actually very precisely. So you could actually decide when you map the axis to understand what kind of grade you would use to move the client from one square to the other. And when you have that, just proceed with the interviews and map each and every person you talk to on the scale to understand what kind of clouds or what kind of sections you actually get out of it, so to understand to which needs to address. And usually what we have seen is actually that you end up never having more than 4 or 5 archetypes. And usually if you have 5, then the client says that, okay, these 2 are maybe not so important. So you would actually end up with 3, 4 that you're working with, and then it's super clear and super easy to focus on the personas that are actually important.
Okay. There is a question. Mm-hmm. During this kickoff meeting, the first meeting with the clients where you talk about extremes, does those questions that I would name now seem appropriate? Like, let's segment the customers by the activities they do with the service, or what they want to do while performing those activities, and what they don't want, or is it too specific for the beginning?
Well, it a bit depends on the project. It might be okay, actually, but sometimes it depends who is around the table, and maybe you would like to, it would make more sense to start with something more general.
Okay.
It's really case by case, because in sometimes if you go with very specific questions, it becomes very sensitive very soon. You sort of need to get everybody on board first.
Super. There's a question again. How you name or make group of personas? You group based on some characteristics and behaviors. How do you group them?
Again, it's very creative approach. So you group them based on something, right? So they're either yeah, oh, I can actually go back probably a couple of slides and give you an examples. They actually end up having similarities. They have similar knowledge of financial stuff, right? So their financial awareness and technological awareness is quite minimal. So they end up in this one bubble, and you would actually give them the name that sort of describes that. It doesn't have to be always descriptive. It can be something poetic. And actually with Enterprise Estonia, what is interesting is that they are actually now using, very, as I mentioned before, that people who are not even working with this project, they have not been involved, they're actually using this Pilot and Mountaineer and Nordic Walker in their internal communication to sort of describe the profile of the customer. So it's sticking.
Super. The question I asked before, when the bank discovers that they serve poorly some segments of the customers, some archetypes, do they try to return those customers later after they redesign the app, for example?
It's typically the strategic decision, right? So what does it mean that they're underserved? Because if it means that there is a lack of some very specific service that these guys would need, then it's a business decision whether they want to launch this kind of service or not, and then it's a bigger discussion. If it's just an issue of a small feature, then generally every bank that we have worked with does not have a problem with that, if it really would solve somebody's pain. But typically, launching a new banking service on a broader scale, for example, if there is no, I don't know, if there is no credit card of a premium class and this specific customer needs a premium class credit card, then it's strategic decision if the company is actually willing to make this kind of large step. And if yes, then sure.
Okay, super, thank you. Well, I don't see more questions in the chat for the moment. I would like to see proposing customer journeys. Do you cover the whole service development, including all touch points and related steps?
Yes, when we work with customer journeys, concluding the research phase, so this is something that we share with the customers. We give them the profile of personas and we present sort of the typical journey, which can be a pretty extensive document. We actually go into quite a lot of depth in there, at least on the proposal level, because usually we go point by point. In every point of the journey, there are comments and suggestions of what could be made. And then again, it's a strategic discussion with the company. If they decide to go into extensive service development, then yes. But okay. Sometimes it can be something very small that they choose to implement, or it can be saying, yes, let's redo the whole thing.
Super, thank you.
I can give you a few, and just an example from a retail customer we had. We drew out the whole journey and giving them different suggestions, from going into e-commerce up to changing the opening hours of the store. They decided that, okay, maybe e-commerce is kind of a big and complex step, and they chose to go with the easy version and change the opening hours. It increased sales quite a bit, so that was enough. So there's not always need to go into extensive service development.
It sounds like a Nordic Walker.
Well, no, actually, they were a bit more ambitious, but for some reason, for this case, it was enough.
Okay, super, thank you. Do you call it personas? When working with this stakeholder who has never been exposed to the service design?
Yes, we do call those personas. And if we really have a client who doesn't have much experience with service design, even, for example, even if the contact person knows service design well, but then doing the first workshop with all the stakeholders, we actually have this little session dedicated into explaining what service design process is, what are the key terms. We explain the personas. We have few exercises just to sort of get everybody on board. It's sometimes looked at skeptically at first, but it really pays off. So this introductory workshop, we actually incorporate some sort of training elements into it, and then we can work with the process in using all the fancy terms.
Manish asks, slide with point 1, could you expand on the focus? I'm not sure.
Was with slide with point 1?
This one?
No. I guess it's one of those, but not because there's also 2 with point 1.
Okay, I'm not sure.
So, Manish, maybe you can specify your question. Or not.
Okay, while Manish answers, how does design thinking play into the services you provide to your clients?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question so well. What do you mean play into? We follow the design process. Well, I can't say we follow it by the book because there is always something that needs an exception. But in general, there's usually the process that we follow is that it is a design process, and the client is usually very heavily involved. Of course, we sometimes have the clients or the organizations who prefer just to give us the task, say like you do your thing and bring us the answer. But actually we see more and more that everybody is heavily interested in co-creation. So it's not just the company or the organization around the table, but they want to bring in the users and have actually this discussion all together. And and then you would have the users, the customers, and the management level of the organization, plus everybody in between. So it's inclusive design and nothing else.
Super, thank you. Manish says that last question. What to include into the report that you give to the stakeholders on the insights?
Honestly speaking, everything that you have, it just has to be presented in a very nice and clear way. So we typically start with explaining what was the research, what was the essential task that they approach us with. We describe the methodology because this is important. Usually, if you just go and tell somebody, especially in the finance center, right? These are the guys that are used to having extensive numbers and Excel tables. And if you go and say, here we had 3 interviews and here's the results, they will not take you seriously. So we actually explain about the methodology to kind of give it some weight. So this is the first part. The second part is the description of the personas. So now we incorporate this kind of persona card, as we call it, plus the matrix to explain the whole universe of personas. And then we go in journeys, point by point, 1 journey per persona typically. And journey also means that we actually map out the problems or the suggestions for improvements in every point. And then after this report, there is a strategic discussion when we actually decide what we're going to focus on the solution phase, because there's usually from this point there is so many directions to go.
Super. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I believe it's time for us to wrap up. I would like to say thank you to Jana. That was a great presentation with a lot of details and insights in many structured way. We learned more about two different industries. Well, from my side, I share the experience of building such archetype maps, and it's really a powerful tool. So please say thank you again to Jana.
My very strong request is try it out and actually come back with the comments if you come across some sort of problems or questions while using this matrix. Actually please come find me in LinkedIn or email me directly, because I would actually like to again once again the academic in me, right, the researcher in me wants to develop this tool, and I would like to look more into using it in very different settings. So if you have any ideas or thoughts, just approach me in any social media. Let's talk about it.
Super. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for coming. Our marathon goes on, and tomorrow we will be talking about service design for educational programs and how to make more programmers in the world so that service designers have more hands to implement our ideas. Thank you again and welcome, and see you tomorrow. Jana, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.